Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Cameron Francis from Dovetail. Welcome to today's presentation, Understanding Methamphetamine. We've got a pretty chockers presentation today for you, where I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of the history of methamphetamine, of where it's come from, how it is that we've got to where we are today. I'm going to cover some of the stats around methamphetamine use in the population. I'm also going to talk about some of the harms and some of the ways that workers can work with people that use methamphetamine to reduce some of those harms as well. So hopefully you'll enjoy today's presentation. Before we go much further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we meet on today and pay my respects to the elders past and present. Before we kick off though, I will give you a bit of a spiel about Dovetail, about who we are. Dovetail is a small project based here in Queensland in Metro North, and we provide clinical advice and professional support to workers, services and communities across Queensland who engage with young people affected by alcohol and other drug use. We don't work directly with young people, we work with services, either around complex case issues that a service might have with a young person. We can work with a whole service around policy and procedures around working with young people, but also entire communities. If they identify an issue with young people and drugs, we can come in and work with all of the services in that community to do action planning around how to better respond to that. So that's a little bit about us. We have currently got 3 staff, 1 vacancy. We've actually just recruited, you have to change that. We're a little team of 4 based here in Brisbane, but we do cover the entire state of Queensland. Check out our website for more information about Dovetail, dovetail.org.au. You can subscribe to our weekly email digest there as well if you're interested. Once a week we'll put out an email with a few bits of practice tools, research, news from the alcohol and drug sector, and just some tools to help you do your job basically. So subscribe there if you'd like. Also make sure you check out our video gallery where we record lots of our presentations as we are doing today and store them on our video gallery on our website. Before we go much further though, to start off we really need to clarify some of our terminology around this area, and I know from if you follow the news there's a lot of confusion about some of these terms. On the screen now I've got for you 2 molecules. I've got the amphetamine molecule and the methamphetamine molecule. These are 2 different substances, they're 2 different drugs. Now you'll notice in the media and elsewhere that you'll see people talking about amphetamines with an S. Now that's referring to the entire family of drugs from the amphetamine family. So that includes drugs like ecstasy or MDMA, it includes methamphetamine, it includes amphetamine, dexamphetamine, etc, etc, etc. So amphetamines with an S is referring to that class of amphetamine drugs, sometimes called amphetamine type stimulants or ATS. Now, to make it confusing, amphetamine with no S is an actual substance, it's a drug. Traditionally, we would see amphetamine sulfate in Queensland up until about the mid-90s, where we switched from amphetamine to methamphetamine, which is a different drug. So I'm going to tell you a bit today about how that happened, how we transferred from amphetamine as the primary stimulant to methamphetamine, and then how we've got to the ICE situation today. Before we go much further though, I do need to talk about some of the stats and the rates of use. There's a lot of debate about, is it an epidemic, is it not an epidemic? And there's been a bit of confusion around about that. But this graph I've got on the screen here, this is from the National Household Survey from 2013. And what you can see there is the patterns of drug use over time. You can see that from 2001 to 2013, that overall there's actually been a fairly significant decline in rates of methamphetamine use in that period. A slight increase in the older age groups only. We know that in the late 90s, early 2000s, that was a time of very heavy drug use. So if anything, we've probably come down from those higher rates of population use. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have a problem with methamphetamine. This next graph will show you that what the change that has occurred is this shift in the form of methamphetamine that people are using. So you can see here, we've gone from the powdered form being the most common from 2007 to 2010, but then 2010 to 2013, a massive decline in use of powdered methamphetamine and an increase in the use of the crystalline form. So what that means is that while we may not have increased the overall population of people who are using methamphetamine, the form that they're using has changed, and it's changed from a less pure and probably less harmful form to a more pure and therefore more harmful form of the drug. So this is why we may not have seen an overall increase in the number of people using, but we've seen an increase in harm. Since this data has come out, it has been confirmed. We've got data from emergency departments, data from ambulance, we've got data from drug and alcohol treatment services as well, which has all shown increasing presentations from people who are using methamphetamine over the last probably 2 to 3 years. So just to take the story back to the beginning of where these drugs have come from, where the amphetamine stimulants have come from, first synthesized in 1887 was amphetamine sulfate. Methamphetamine itself was invented a few years after that in Japan. Now, these drugs were mostly used in military context initially, in World War I and in World War II. But soldiers from both sides of the conflict were using amphetamines in combat, so the fighter pilots would be given amphetamines to keep them awake for those long journeys. Famously, so the story goes, Hitler was injected every morning by his personal physician with a shot of methamphetamine to kick off his day. So we've had, it's often, they were originally associated with the military. After World War II finished is when we saw the first methamphetamine epidemic in a population. That was in Japan following World War II. There ended up being a lot of unemployed people because of the empire falling, and also lots of methamphetamine had been stockpiled for the war. So we had a sort of perfect situation, perfect storm for methamphetamine dependence in that population. And there's actually some great research from Japan from the 1950s, which looked at things like dependence and psychosis and all the problems that we're familiar with today with methamphetamine. Following World War II, most of these, the amphetamine and methamphetamine were used as prescription drugs. They were often used as weight loss drugs, and they were sometimes over-the-counter, sometimes prescription-only medications. And that continued to cause harm in the population. There still were people developing dependence and psychosis and all those other problems. By the 60s in Australia, they were restricted even further, and that's when we saw illicit amphetamines turning up. So on the screen there now is an ad for the Benzedrine inhaler for physicians in the armed forces. Recommend Benzedrine. These are methamphetamine inhalers, which contain a small dose of methamphetamine. This one is a bit later on when methamphetamine was being used as a weight loss drug here called Obertrol. This one is a few milligrams of methamphetamine in each tablet. And this one, Apatrol, is dextroamphetamine sustained release. And you can see continuing victory at the front line there on the slide. So these drugs were associated with the military for quite some time. So this sort of bounced around for a while. It was a prescription drug. It was often misused by stereotypically housewives of the 1950s housewife popping a few pep pills to brighten the day and help with the vacuuming. When those drugs were restricted in the 60s, we saw the first illicit manufacture of amphetamines turning up. And so we saw the sort of so-called, the clandestine labs appearing around Australia and cooks making amphetamine sulfate. What that did was we saw a shift in population using it from the middle-aged housewife popping these prescription tablets to unemployed males using illicit amphetamine, and they were injecting that amphetamine as well. So that was when we got to the point where we are now with this illicit amphetamine market. In Queensland, with most of the production that we had, most of the drugs that we had here was actually amphetamine sulfate up until about the mid-90s. In the mid-90s, the precursors to amphetamine sulfate were restricted, and that made it harder to produce. At the same time, as the story goes, in the mythology, was that an illicit chemist in Queensland had dreamt up a new way of manufacturing methamphetamine out of pseudoephedrine, out of Sudafed. And this particular illicit chemist dreamt up this new method, tried it out, and it worked. And it was a genuine revolution in chemistry to manufacture methamphetamine in this particular method. Then this particular chemist then sold that method on to other chemists in the so-called box labs, where people could purchase a box with the glassware and the instructions on how to produce methamphetamine out of pseudoephedrine. This was a big change. I started just working in alcohol and drug at the time this happened, and what our clients noticed was that they were paying $60 or $70 for a gram of amphetamine powder called speed, and all of a sudden, almost overnight, people were being charged $60 for 0.1 of a gram for this stuff called base or pure. A lot of our clients were really confused at the time, and so were we. We didn't really know what was happening. What we did notice, though, was an increase in harm straight away. We saw psychosis and dependence. Not that we didn't see that with amphetamine sulfate, but with methamphetamine, it just seemed to be inducing it much faster. And that's because methamphetamine is a different drug and it's more harmful. It lasts longer. It can induce dependence more intensely. And it was often sold for injection as well. So here's a bag of what people call base. This is the stuff produced out of those box labs. It's got the reddish colour there from the ingredients. They're using iodine or red phosphorus in that to convert the pseudoephedrine. This stuff was coming, you can see in that bag that's a bit wet, so people would add water to it in order to get it out of the bag and then inject. And so we saw this sort of spike in injecting in the late 90s. We also saw a spike in hepatitis C because of this as well. So, as I've already mentioned, we saw this shift in the late 90s from amphetamine to methamphetamine, which was associated with an increase in harm. And that increase in harm is because methamphetamine has a stronger effect on central nervous system, it's longer acting, some of the forms are more suited to harmful routes of administration as well, such as intravenous or smoked, which came a bit later, and it's more likely to lead to psychosis. So getting close to our recent history, I did track down the first Australian Federal Police seizure of methamphetamine, crystal meth, happened in 1997, where 4.5 kilos of what they described as a Chinese New Age drug was seized. And the police reported that it was too early to describe it as a threat to Australia, but it is a potential threat. Interesting to reflect on that now in this, nearly 20 years later, what's happened with it. In the early 2000s, we had a heroin drought here in Australia, where the heroin became really hard to come by. The heroin drought, though, was associated also with an ice flood. Those two things happened at the same time. Heroin went away, ice emerged rapidly. There was no kind of coincidence around that. The same people who were producing and exporting heroin from Southeast Asia had just switched to producing and exporting methamphetamine in the crystal methamphetamine instead. It's a really a purely business decision to do that. Heroin is fairly labour intensive to produce. If you have to plant a field of poppies, you have to then hand score each of the poppies and scrape that tar, the opium tar, off to produce heroin. The heroin itself can be ruined by moisture in transit. Obviously, it's coming from a tropical area across the ocean into Australia, so it can be ruined in transit. Whereas crystal meth can be produced in a small lab in the jungle somewhere. It only takes a couple of people to produce it, and they can produce hundreds of kilos really, really quickly. It's also a very stable substance, so it can be dissolved in numerous different products in order to smuggle it into Australia. I think we just saw last week there was a seizure of it. They look like they were these Chinese imported bras, which have these sort of gel-filled cups in them to make your breasts appear larger, and that gel was methamphetamine liquid, about 700 litres of methamphetamine liquid smuggled in like that. So, one of the reasons that methamphetamine has become popular is because of the way that it's easier to smuggle than some of the other drugs. So we started to see a lot of problems from crystal meth in the early 2000s. You might remember by the mid-2000s, Four Corners screened the Ice Age, which is a great overview of methamphetamine use. It's still available on the ABC website, and it's worth watching. It's now 10 years old, but really nothing in that has changed. What we noticed in the mid-2000s was that the ice appeared to decline in availability again. It wasn't consistently available. I was working in western suburbs of Brisbane at the time, and we would see waves of meth come through, or waves of ice come through, and my clients would use ice for maybe a month, and then it would disappear, and we wouldn't see it again for another month or two, which was probably because it was being imported from overseas, and there were sort of batches of it rolling through. That's something that we think has changed this time around, that there seems to be more crystal meth in the community so that people are consistently able to get access to it. So on the screen there is the forms of methamphetamine, the methamphetamine ID sheet. And this is all of the forms of meth available right now. Now, in Queensland, no matter where you're working in Queensland, if your clients are using speed or base or ice or GOE or quick or fast or up or whatever the names people have for all of the amphetamine type stimulants, it is methamphetamine. It's all methamphetamine in Queensland now, and it has been for some time. That's pretty much true of most of Australia. There's a few examples in remote parts of Australia where amphetamine sulfate still appears, but it's basically all methamphetamine. The only difference is the form that it comes in. So everything listed on the screen there as A is what people would call speed. So that's methamphetamine powder. It's probably between 5 and 10% purity. Everything listed as B is what people would call base. This is the stuff produced in the box lab with pseudoephedrine. This would often be anywhere from 10 to 40% pure. Everything listed as C is what people refer to as ice. Ice is manufactured in industrial scale labs. It's not made by your home backyard meth cook or a 16-year-old who's bought some equipment at Bunnings. It's manufactured using industrial chemical equipment on a very large scale, which is how they manage to get the high purity. The purity can be anywhere from 60 to 90 something percent. But it's really important to note that these are the same drug. It's all methamphetamine. It doesn't matter the form of it. One of the problems at the moment is that there's been such a focus on ice specifically that we're hearing from workers are saying that the young people are saying that they don't use ice because ice is dangerous. They just take base or speed instead because it's a different drug. It's not a different drug. It's all the same chemical. It's probably worth thinking about it like if speed of the A listed drugs, if that's like beer and ice is like vodka. It's all alcohol. It's just the purity associated with it. So probably 2 years ago, it's actually about maybe 3 years now, Dovetail started receiving reports from workers around Queensland about increasing use of ice again. We heard about easier access in some of the regions. We saw reports of very young people taking up use. And we also heard through the media of large-scale Southeast Asian ice labs turning up here in Australia. And I think Murwillumbah was one of the first, probably nearly 10 years ago now, that turned up. And that was a large-scale Chinese ice lab, which was in the rainforest down there in northern New South Wales. And they'd been producing hundreds of kilos of crystal meth down there. So things have changed. And I think more recently as well, the more recent changes that we know that we've now got crystal meth being sent to Australia from South America. That's new. We haven't had that before. It's mostly come from Southeast Asia until recently. Part of that is because Australians pay the most for illicit drugs of anywhere on earth. And so we are a target for all of these international cartels who want to make lots of money. On the screen here, that's a picture of some ice crystals. You can see why it's called ice. It looks just like ice. Or rock salt is another analogy. So what exactly is this stuff called ice? It's just high purity methamphetamine. I should also say that when we're having professional communications with workers around this, we prefer to call it methamphetamine rather than ice. Ice is just the particular form, so just think about that when you're writing reports or court reports and that kind of thing. We would prefer to call it methamphetamine rather than the slang term ice. So it's methamphetamine, but it's produced in a different method to the box lab method, which produces base. It is not a different drug. It's the same drug as meth, base, speed, GOE, whatever. And like all the other forms of meth, it can be swallowed, snorted, smoked, shafted, or injected. If you don't know, shafting is suppository. People would mix it with a little bit of warm water in a syringe without a needle and up the bum. We recommend that mostly for injectors who've damaged their veins and can't get access to their veins anymore. That would be a harm reduction recommendation. But how does it work? It's pretty straightforward. We know a lot about how it works because it's been around for such a long time. It basically just stimulates release of dopamine, and then it blocks reuptake of the dopamine. So the dopamine just sits there in the receptors for longer than it should. It's a very straightforward mechanism of action. So how long does it last? The half-life is how long it takes the body to process half of the drug. So this up there I've got there's three routes of administration with how long the half-life is: smoked, intravenous, intranasal. And you can see not a massive difference in half-life depending on how the people are using it. It's about 10.7 hours or so. what that means is half the dose is being cleared from the body at that time. So most people off a single dose of methamphetamine would stay awake and would be affected by the drug for about 24 hours at a minimum of a single sort of dose of it. This particular study that tracked that half-life is a really interesting study. It's very technical. They got people in the lab, they gave them methamphetamine, and then took blood every half hour to check the levels in their system to do this, and it's all very technical. But if the research finishes with this line which says that, interestingly, 100% of the study participants talked continuously for the entire 24 hours of the experiment, which is obviously one of the notable effects of methamphetamine, is the talkativeness. Methamphetamine can be detected in urine up to 72 hours on a urine drug screen. Now that's pretty generous, actually, 72 hours. While that's technically possible, we do hear anecdotally from clients who will say that they are clear on a urine drug screen much less than that. So there's, people would report being clear at 48 hours and sometimes less than that. So while 72 hours is technically how long it can be detected, it can be much less than that. We do hear in mining communities, mining people reporting using meth on the weekend and then passing a urine drug screen on a Monday. So you do have to be a little bit careful with relying on urine drug screens for people using meth. So how does it work? For those interested in the brain, there's a nice picture of it for you to show you how it works. And as I mentioned earlier, it's promoting the release of dopamine into the synapse and then blocking its reuptake, so it sits there at that receptor site longer than it should, and that creates the euphoria that people experience. This graph just demonstrates it compared to other drugs, but also things like food as well, and even water. If you ever drink some water, there'll be a small dopamine release as well. This graph is a little deceptive though, because none of the other drugs work purely on dopamine the way meth does, but you can see there that meth is obviously all it does is stimulate that massive release of dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's associated with reward and motivation and drive. So obviously when we're messing with that can give us some clues to what some of the after effects might be when people stop using it. In terms of the effects of methamphetamine, I'll urge caution on this slide, because people can use methamphetamine and not exhibit a lot of outward signs that they're using. So be really careful trying to guess who you think's using and who's not. Some of the effects of methamphetamine are actually very, very similar to the effects of mental illness, particularly someone who's in a manic episode, someone with bipolar disorder in a manic episode can present just like someone who is on methamphetamine. But on the screen there are the list of effects. Not everyone gets really, really dilated pupils, or if they've got people become quite tolerant fairly quickly, and so they may only have dilated pupils for a couple of hours after they've injected. So you can't really, and I've been fooled by the best of them. I've had clients come and see me for long periods of time, and I've had no idea that they're actually high on meth the entire time. So be really careful. You'll accidentally accuse someone who's not using meth of using it, and then you'll miss someone else who's actually intoxicated. There is the increased alertness, energy, motor and speech activity is one of them. Increased self-confidence and concentration, euphoria. Reduced appetite is a really big one. People can't eat for sometimes significant period of time after using. Jaw clenching and grinding, and this may not always be really, really noticeable. Sometimes the jaw grinding could be really subtle. One of the little signs of the grinding might be, you could be talking to someone and notice that the temples are just moving a little bit here while you're talking to them, because they're just subtly grinding their jaw while you talk to them. When it's quite extreme, at the really extreme end, you can sometimes hear it. You can actually hear people chomping their teeth and clenching, and actually their jaw really wobbling while you talk to them. It can be tremor, anxiety, panic. Increased body temperature, heart rate and perspiration is another one. So some of the harms, these will be quite familiar to a lot of people. Weight loss and malnutrition is a really big one. People can't eat when they're using meth. They often don't feel hungry. And then once it's worn off and they do feel hungry, often people still have trouble getting food down afterwards. So one of the malnutrition can be a real issue, and it can actually relate to some of the other mental health effects too. Sometimes if someone's starting to develop paranoia, or they're starting to see things at the corner of their eyes, it could be from malnutrition. It could also be from dehydration as well. So I'll talk more about that in a sec. Depression is obviously a real problem as well. Once people have used methamphetamine, they'll have a come down where after it's worn off, where they'll get low mood. And that low mood could persist for a few days afterwards, up to a week afterwards in some people. So the come down period often gets worse and worse the more frequently people use. If someone's already got depression or another mental illness, that can become a really risky time after they've used. They can, self-harm, or their depression can really be exacerbated if they've already got it. Give me chronic sleep problems, obviously. People who inject develop vein problems. Methamphetamine is very harsh on the veins, so veins collapse and become damaged, and people have trouble getting access. So across a weekend, people can really inject a number of times and cause themselves a lot of damage. Dependence, which I'll talk about a bit more in a sec. Poor cognitive function, and this is particularly around areas of motivation and planning as well. So one of the effects of meth is it makes it hard for people to plan. There's some implications for that when you're working with people that do use meth. In terms of coming into treatment, is if you're booking appointments 2 weeks in advance, they may not remember that appointment. So you'd have to keep that in mind about how you can structure your treatment to compensate for that. I mean, one technique might be don't book appointments a week in advance with someone. You might let them know you'll ring them in a week, and then when you ring them, book the appointment for tomorrow, or book the appointment for that afternoon if you can. So you might have to just restructure some of the ways that you engage with people to account for that. I will say though, particularly young people do recover quite well when they stop using. If people stop using, get some good food, exercise, a general healthy living, a fair amount of that cognitive function can be repaired in young people. It's questionable in older people or people who've used for significant periods of time, but I think we should be really careful to go quickly labelling people as sort of brain damaged who've been using meth, because I think when we do that, we remove any reason someone might want to get better. I think we should focus on the fact that people can and do recover quite well after using methamphetamine, and that's a really useful message to give people that take the drug. People can have seizures. Women can develop menstrual problems, irregular periods, and some of this could be to do with malnutrition as well. I should mention too that in pregnancy, surprisingly enough, methamphetamine doesn't have a sort of it's not a teratogen in the same way that, say, alcohol is, creating sort of fetal alcohol disorder, but it can cause low birth weights. It can induce early labour in women who are pregnant as well. Psychosis is an issue, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a sec. And there's also the problem of overdose. It's a bit tricky. A lot of our clients will tell us, you can't overdose on meth. That's because people think an overdose is where you inject and you drop on the floor, like a heroin overdose. And even workers sort of think that's what an OD is. And because a methamphetamine overdose doesn't really look like that, people assume you can't OD on meth. But that's not true. You can overdose on meth. When people do overdose on meth, the main problems that they develop is overheating. Their body temperature just goes off the chart, and they can get organ damage from that. It can also cause heart attacks as well when they've had the overdose. I should mention though that not that many people die from using methamphetamine. I think in Australia at the moment, about 170 or so people last year died from methamphetamine. Now that compares to opioids, which is at over 1,000 people per year are dying from opioid use in Australia at the moment. So while the death rate is actually not that high, it's not as high as it is with opioids. So methamphetamine often doesn't cause death in the same ways or as frequently as other drugs do. It does cause a range of other problems though. I should also mention that people die off standard doses of methamphetamine. The overdose is not the only risk. Some people can use the same amount that they always use and they have a heart attack, or they have a brain aneurysm, they have a stroke because of the rapid change in blood pressure while they inject. So people die from standard doses, it should be mentioned. What about dependence? And I know this is probably the big concern that workers have got, is about dependence. And we know because methamphetamine works on dopamine, a reward sort of chemical, it can induce a fairly severe dependence. It does appear that different routes of administration have got different risks for inducing dependence. Now, that's partly because of if you ever get a route of administration where people become rapidly intoxicated, the route of administration becomes reinforced. So smoking of anything, cigarette smokers get attached to this mechanism, this motion that they are bringing the cigarette to their mouth. Their fingers need to feel something. to keep busy sort of thing. So this can occur in people using methamphetamine. Injecting and smoking seem to be the really problematic routes of administration. Not to say that the other routes won't induce dependence, but just hearing from young people, they'll say that it's very easy to have a toke on an ice pipe. It doesn't feel like such a big deal if there's an ice pipe going around a party. So from this sort of easy initiation, we have seen these reports of fairly rapid dependence where someone has never used it, they go to a party, try it on the weekend, and then fall into a pattern of regular using quite quickly because of it. There's some of this, the problem with smoking and injecting is this the way that the drug is rapidly absorbed into the system as well. People get a rush, the effects then plateau and then drop relatively rapidly. What that does is makes people want to go back and get some more and top up and avoid the come down. So this sort of creates this kind of binging and crashing sort of pattern that people fall into. So methamphetamine dependence can look a bit different to some other drug dependence that we're familiar with. If you think about alcohol dependence or opioid dependence, people need that drug in order to stop going to physical withdrawal. If you're using heroin, you really need to use every single day, first thing in the morning, or else you're going to be in withdrawal. That isn't always how methamphetamine dependence presents. People using meth can use in a more erratic kind of manner. The more frequently people use, then the dopamine receptors in their brain become less effective. The brain doesn't produce as much dopamine and the dopamine receptors don't function as well, which means that people start to not experience the things that dopamine should be inducing for them naturally. So people, after they've used regularly for a while, report low mood, low motivation, and this can persist for a significant period of time once they stop using. It can be from a month to 6 months to 12 months, potentially a little bit more than that as well, depending on how long they've used and how heavily they've used. But this long sort of persistent low mood that people can experience makes them believe that they're never going to get better. People think that, we tell them if you stop using meth, you will feel better, and then they quit, and 3 months later they're still feeling depressed and flat. They can't get out of bed. Activities that usually make them happy just don't make them very happy. Then they use meth again and everything feels normal. So that does lead people to believe that they permanently damage their brain in a way that they'll never experience pleasure again unless they use meth. And I think we've got to be really careful as workers we don't reinforce that. We have to let people know that they do get better and they do feel better and their moods will improve over time if they just get into some good healthy living, is pretty easy. When you think about it, good diet, sleep, exercise, food and time. There is a bit of a problem with some of the occupational groups, people using meth for work, particularly say, the stereotype of the truck driver who uses methamphetamine to drive from Cairns to Melbourne in 3 days. Once someone's been using like that, they need to recover, they need to sleep for 3 days after they've done that. But if they're working, they don't have time to come down. So people end up trapped in this sort of occupational using cycle where they have to use to go to work, to earn money to pay for more meth to go to work again, and they don't have a week to feel flat and tired to sort of come down, and so they end up a bit stuck using. So I mentioned that a lot of the patterns of using of meth are not as sort of stable as you might see with an opioid user or in alcohol dependence. And that's because often we see this sort of binging, crashing pattern. It might be that people score methamphetamine on their payday and they might, purchase a quantity and use it for as long as they can until it runs out. And they might stay awake for 2 or 3 days or 4 days, and then they come down, they have low mood, sleep for a couple of days, feel pretty crappy for another week, and then it's payday again, and then use again, and go on a big bender and then crash. So you'll often see this more sort of chaotic patterns of using amongst meth users, and it's worth tracking these patterns with people and helping to educate them about these patterns as well. I worked with a young fellow a while ago now who was a very infrequent methamphetamine user. He'd only use every 2 months or every 3 months. And when he would use, he'd go on a bender. He'd use for 2 or 3 or 4 days at a time. And then his next week or his next 2 weeks, his life would just disintegrate. He'd had all these terrible things would happen. He'd have fights with his family and his girlfriend would kick him out and all this stuff. And then he'd gradually come good again and life would be fine for another 2 months. And then he uses again. And I was working with him over a period of months, and I was using an outcome measurement tool with him where we were tracking how he was going. And after I'd seen him go through this pattern a couple of times, I actually pulled out the results of our outcome measurement tool with him, and we graphed them. And so I pulled the graph out and showed him, can you see how life goes really, really well? You use meth, and then you have these 2 weeks where everything's really terrible, and then things go good again. And he was really like, oh wow, yeah, I hadn't actually noticed that. He hadn't realised the impact it was having on his moods. So just think about that when you're working with clients as to what their patterns are, and also whereabouts they are in the pattern when you are working with them. If they come into your service and they're on day 2 of a bender, they're really, really intoxicated right now, that's going to limit what you can do with them. But likewise, if they're 2 or 3 days after a bender, you could expect them to have low mood, be flat, feeling really tired, sleeping a lot, that kind of thing. So it's worth tracking the pattern to know where that person might be. Onto the psychosis, and I think psychosis is a real concern for workers because it's really difficult to manage sometimes, and people can injure themselves and other people while they're in that state. We've known about the meth psychosis ever since this drug was invented. From the very beginning, methamphetamine has been known to induce psychosis. And meth psychosis is a bit different to other drug psychosis. Like say that, when we see young people develop psychotic symptoms following heavy cannabis use, there's often a pattern that follows. It tends to be that young person has some vulnerability to the psychotic symptoms, often a family history. It might be. They've usually also started cannabis use at a very young age and very heavily. We don't all have the same vulnerability to that kind of psychosis. Methamphetamine is different. Every single person in this room would become psychotic on methamphetamine if they took enough of it. The only difference is what our particular thresholds might be. Some of us might be able to stay awake for 5 days before we develop paranoia. Other people might be awake for 24 hours before they start to develop the symptoms. So everyone can become psychotic from methamphetamine. It just depends on your personal vulnerability to when that would occur. We know this is some research from Sydney where they looked at regular meth users to find out how many of them had experienced psychotic symptoms, and they found relatively high rates. 13% screened positive for psychosis and 23% had a clinically significant symptom of psychosis. So it's actually relatively common for meth users to have had some experience of this. However, most of these people who develop these psychotic symptoms are only experiencing them for a very short period of time. In this study, they reckoned it was an average of 2 to 3 hours. Now, most of these people are probably at the end of a bender and they're getting paranoid at the end after being awake for a day or 2 or 3. They then stop using and go to bed and wake up fine. They wake up without the psychotic symptoms. Now, we know though that once someone has had a psychotic episode once, it seems that their threshold drops. So that the next time, maybe they were awake for 3 nights before they became psychotic this time. Next time it might be 2 days before they develop those symptoms. So we know that the threshold can drop over time and people can tip over into the psychosis more easily. We know that the ones who go to hospital end up being a bit different. The people who end up in hospital for psychosis are obviously not recovering in a couple of hours. Those psychotic symptoms have hung around. There's some great research from Japan looking at this, and the Japanese research is really useful because it's probably the only country on earth that can do meth research where this population have only used methamphetamine. In Australia, we can't do this study because our meth users drink huge amounts of alcohol, they smoke heaps of cannabis as well, they take benzos, all other drugs. So it's really hard for us to get a pure sample. But this research from Japan in the early 90s is really good because it's a purely meth-using sample, and this was a bunch of people who had presented to hospital with meth psychosis. So these are obviously already more severe than your average person. What they found was that 64% of these people who presented to hospital recovered within 10 days of ceasing using. So they call these the transient type psychosis. So, nearly 2/3 of the people recovered quite quickly within 10 days. By 30 days, another 18% recovered, and they referred to these as the prolonged type. After a month, a further 18% were still psychotic, and they were considered the persistent type. So in this 18%, these are probably the people where it may have triggered an ongoing psychotic illness. Now, this is not 18% of meth users, I should say. These are people who presented to hospital with psychosis. So it's already a fairly severe population. But you can see that it's really useful to get an idea of the trajectory of that psychosis. They also found that almost all of these people had a very similar psychotic. It was a paranoid type psychosis with auditory hallucinations. And it is remarkable how meth psychosis presents so similar. Pretty much every person I've dealt with who's had a meth psychosis has been the same. They always have persecutory paranoia, believing someone's out to get me, I'm being watched, I'm being chased, that kind of thing. So what about treatment approaches? There's been a lot of research into pharmacotherapies, and there's been a lot of hope that maybe we'll find a magical pill which will make it all better. But it hasn't looked so great so far for that. There's been some research on amphetamine substitution, and there's actually a trial underway at the moment in Sydney, which has been looking at a small group of treatment-resistant methamphetamine users, and they've been supplied with an amphetamine-type stimulant in order to see if it can work a little bit like methadone. And I believe that the results of that are actually quite positive at this stage. There's a fair way to go in that research in terms of having something like that rolled out broadly. And it's also probably unlikely that that's an option for large numbers of people as well. They're really looking at a very small cohort of really chaotic heavy drug users in that study. But otherwise, after looking at a whole range of other drugs to treat meth dependence, nothing's turned out to be so great. And I know that different doctors in different regions have preferences for how they should treat it. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. Ultimately, the research has not shown us that anything is any better than anything else in managing methamphetamine dependence. At this stage, the research does show that our standard AOD treatment approaches are effective, and that's motivational interviewing, cognitive behaviour therapy, and some good old-fashioned sleep, food, exercise, and time. So just to wrap up now, some key messages for people who are using meth. Obviously, injectors need the same injecting advice anyone who injects gets around that, you know, we want to encourage people to use safer routes of administration other than injecting. But always use new needles, rotate injecting sites because meth is really caustic on the veins. Mix up with plenty of sterile water. People believe that if they only use a little bit of water, they get a better rush. But really all they're doing is making that solution that much harsher on their veins. Obviously wash hands, clean injecting site, and dispose of equipment safely. For everyone who uses meth though, here's some other generic messages, and we want to let people know that they should try and take a break, that the more regularly people use, the more intense those brain changes will be, and the less effective their dopamine will become. So when people can space out their using, and we don't have a figure on that, but if people who use in an irregular pattern with at least several weeks in between, they're unlikely to experience a lot of that sort of stuff. We also want to let people know to avoid mixing drugs. People can sometimes drink lots of alcohol or take benzos to try and take the edge off the side effects of methamphetamine or to help them go to sleep, and from that can end up benzodependent. People can also overdose on benzos as well while they're trying to come down. You want to educate people about the binging and crashing cycle. Help people, develop some awareness around the impacts of that pattern of using for them, and let them know about tolerance, about how their tolerance gets so severe using methamphetamine, and those come down negative effects get worse and worse over time. And we want to let them know about those brain changes, about what happens in the brain when they do use meth, and also the message then is that they will recover when they stop using. Some key messages for people who are currently using is when did you last sleep is a really good one. If you've got someone currently using, you'd like to know when they last slept. If they haven't slept for 3 days, then okay, you're not going to do too much useful with them today. You'd also want to know when they last ate food and when did they drink water. I'd often kick off interactions with regular meth users with a glass of water. Just to start with, often people are quite dehydrated, and if they're a little bit paranoid and a bit scattered, maybe they're really dehydrated. So I'd start with a glass of water and then see how they go, and often people settle a little bit sometimes from that because they're just so dehydrated. I'd also offer food as well, if you can. And the service I used to work at, we had sustagen, so we could make up a bit of a milkshake. Even a glass of milk is great. Bowl of wheat bix, something soft and easy to swallow can be really good. And if you sit with someone, give them some water, give them some food, wait half an hour to 45 minutes, you can often see that they can settle quite a bit just from doing that. You also want to, when you're working with people using meth, you want to start understanding their pattern. You want to know, what is their pattern of using? Past day, past week, past month, past year, to get the big pattern. How long would they normally stay up for when they are using? How long are their binges going for? Their route of administration. How long have they been without using meth for? Have they been 3 weeks without? And if they have, what was that like? Did they get low mood? Did they have lots of cravings? What was it like? We also want to try and, in a standard motivational interview, we want to do a bit of a decisional balance. What do you like about using meth and what don't you like about using meth? What you'll find is that a lot of people who use meth over time get less good effects from it because of the tolerance, and they get lots of negative effects. So when you're doing this sort of decisional balance with people, you'll often find meth users will start saying, yeah, actually, I don't get much fun out of it, and it causes all these problems. So it's I always found meth users really good to work with because of that fact. The other key messages is that, like other drug problems, there isn't a magic bullet, there's no magical tablet, there's no magic formula to fix it. We do have to coordinate interventions in specific populations, working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, LGBT populations, etc. Some of those populations will require special responses. But like the other drug problems we deal with, we want to know what the function of the drug is in that person's life. Why do they use it? What is the benefit the person believes that they're getting from it? Because that gives us insights into how they believe, what they believe about their drug use, and what we might want to change. We've also got to give people a bit of a message of hope that you can recover from meth use. These media messages about it's the most addictive drug ever, you're hooked for life, all of this stuff is really unhelpful. I think that makes people believe that they're trapped. Actually, people do recover from meth use all the time. So with good food, sleep, exercise, time, people do get better. There's a little bit of further information for you there on the screen if you're interested. Go and have a look at that. Otherwise, if you are engaging with family members, I'd really recommend Family Drug Support as a contact. They offer a 1300 24/7 telephone counselling line for family members of people who use drugs. Best thing about this is it's staffed by a family member who's been there, who's been through that experience. So that's a really good service for families. Otherwise, you can contact Alcohol and Drug Info Service for information or for telephone counselling for clients as well. Australian Drug Foundation have fact sheets. They also have, their bookshop have posters and brochures and all that sort of material. Reachout.com has got fact sheets that are youth friendly for young people. And somazone.com.au as well. That's a website where young people can post their own questions and have them answered by a health worker. So another great resource. But that's all we've got time for today. There's our contact details on the screen there. If you've got any questions about that, don't hesitate to give us a ring. We'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter.